The final diagnostic light on the primary interface panel shifted from an angry, pulsing crimson to a placid, steady azure. Micah Flint let out a long, ragged breath that he felt like he had been holding in his chest for nearly 5 months. He wiped a thick streak of iridescent thermal grease from his forehead with the back of his calloused hand and tossed his heavy hydrospanner into his battered canvas toolkit. The solid, metallic thud of the tool hitting the bottom of the bag was the single most beautiful sound he had heard since he first set foot on this floating gilded cage. The mirror shield grid of Asterfall Palace was finally stable. It was supposed to be a standard, relatively simple 2-week contract. A basic recalibration of the external xenotech frequency emitters to ensure the royal family did not get vaporized by stray atmospheric radiation. Instead, it had turned into a nearly half-year hostage situation disguised as an extended royal mandate. Every time he packed his tools and requested departure clearance, some new, entirely impossible catastrophe would strike the deep systems of the palace. The High Chancellor's office would then politely but firmly inform him that his ship remained grounded until the royal standard of living was restored. Micah yanked the heavy zipper of his toolbag shut and hoisted it onto his right shoulder. He hated this palace. He would gladly take the most hazardous, radiation-soaked space junkyard in the outer rim over this place any day of the week. A derelict mining freighter floating aimlessly in the dead void possessed a certain brutal, undeniable honesty. Machines, even terribly broken ones, followed the strict laws of physics and fundamental logic. A severed power coupling was just a severed power coupling. You found the break, you soldered the connection, and you moved on. But a royal court was a chaotic, utterly irrational ecosystem of whispered political threats, veiled insults, and impossibly fragile egos, all masquerading as high society. He stepped out of the cramped maintenance crawlspace and out into the vast, open expanse of the main promenade. Asterfall Palace did not possess anything as mundane as standard metal corridors. Instead, it boasted towering, vaulted arteries carved entirely from living siren crystal. As Micah walked, his heavy boots echoing loudly in the cavernous space, the translucent walls pulsed with a slow, rhythmic luminescence. They glowed with a cold, ethereal blue light that perfectly mimicked the beating of a giant, frozen heart. It was undeniably gorgeous, a breathtaking marvel of ancient xenotech, seamlessly integrated with obscene imperial wealth. But it left Micah feeling entirely unwelcome and deeply paranoid. The pale light seemed to actively track his movements. The walls felt less like architectural supports holding up a ceiling, and more like 1,000 unblinking eyes, silently judging the dirty human mechanic tracking engine grease across their immaculate, sacred floors. He kept his head down, purposefully ignoring the disdainful, sideways glances of the silk-draped courtiers, drifting past him like brightly colored ghosts. He needed to reach the eastern landing bay immediately. He had to get his ship off the deck before the royal court decided to invent a brand new, highly specific ceremonial ritual that somehow absolutely required the use of his customized screwdriver. As he marched toward freedom, his mind involuntarily reviewed the bizarre gauntlet of maintenance tickets he had suffered through over the past 20 weeks. None of them made any mechanical sense. He remembered the week the Grand Royal Kitchens went entirely rogue. The molecular synthesizers, designed to create the finest delicacies in the sector, flatly refused to produce anything but perfectly symmetrical cubes of fine, gray ash. The head chef had nearly suffered a nervous breakdown. Then there was the grand gravity elevator in the West Wing. For reasons no diagnostic scan could identify, it simply stopped working unless someone inside the cabin was actively playing a specific, deeply melancholy sonata on a stringed instrument. Micah had spent 3 agonizing days tracing the sensor arrays, tearing up floorboards and recalibrating the anti-mass generators, finding absolutely no mechanical reason for the musical anomaly. And he would certainly never forget the ceremonial artificial intelligence stationed in the grand foyer. It was explicitly programmed to offer grand, historically accurate greetings to visiting dignitaries and diplomats. Instead, for 4 straight days, it had actively welcomed minor lords and barons with cheerful, deeply unsettling phrases. It had greeted the Duke of the Northern Reach by brightly announcing that his bones would make excellent dust for the royal gardens. Micah had essentially been forced to give the ancient machine a digital lobotomy just to get it to stop terrorizing the guests. None of those incidents felt like standard wear and tear. It felt like the palace itself was sick. Or worse, that the palace was incredibly bored and amusing itself at his expense. But that was no longer his problem. He was officially off the clock. The Grand Crystal Promenade terminated at a set of towering blast doors, forged from polished star steel. Micah keyed his override code into the wall terminal. For a brief, terrifying second, the console flashed a yellow warning light, and his stomach plummeted into his boots. But then, the heavy internal mechanisms engaged with a satisfying clank. The massive doors groaned and parted, sliding away into the walls to reveal the vast, open expanse of the eastern landing pad. A violent gust of wind immediately hit him in the chest. It smelled strongly of ozone, heavy salt, and the sweet, electric tang of the Siren Ocean. He stepped out onto the wide platform. Below him, dropping away for thousands of feet, the luminescent silver ocean of the planet churned and glowed. It was a restless, churning sea of liquid starlight, illuminating the dark clouds above. Asterfall Palace hovered stubbornly above the violent waters, a massive, arrogant monument to imperial defiance. And there, sitting alone in the center of the windswept pad, was his ship. The vessel was a heavy wedge of dented gray plating, exposed external wiring, and completely asymmetrical thruster banks. To the refined eyes of the royal court, it was a profound eyesore that ruined their perfect view. To Micah Flint, it was a beautiful, profound promise of absolute freedom. He had maybe 20 paces left to go. Just 20 paces across the plasteel decking, up the lowering hydraulic ramp, and into the cramped, glorious sanctuary of his own cockpit. He calculated that he could have the pre-flight sequence fully completed and the main engines burning at atmospheric exit velocities in under 3 minutes. He took a step forward. The salty wind whipped his heavy canvas jacket around his knees. He took another step. He could almost taste the stale, beautifully recycled air of his own cabin. Then, a sound cut sharply through the howling wind. It was not the high-pitched whine of a malfunctioning turbine. It was not the authoritative, booming shout of a palace guard captain coming to formally revoke his departure clearance. It was a voice. A young, piercingly sharp, fiercely trembling female voice. "Do not go!" The words were spoken with a desperate, heavy finality. They were not a polite request. They were an absolute command, carrying a weight that defied the rushing wind. Micah froze entirely. His heavy leather boot hovered an inch above the metal deck. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, letting out a heavy, defeated sigh, praying to any listening deity in the cosmos that the voice was aimed at someone else. Anyone else. He turned his head slowly, looking back over his shoulder toward the massive, open blast doors. Running frantically across the polished threshold, her heavy, silken robes tangling dangerously around her ankles, was Princess Orla Valor. She looked incredibly tiny against the massive scale of the star steel doors, but she moved with a frantic, terrifying momentum. Before Micah could fully turn around or utter a single word of protest, she collided directly with him. Her small hands shot out, her fingers curling instantly into the heavy, grease-stained fabric of his work jacket. She gripped his sleeve with a desperate, crushing force that seemed entirely impossible for a girl of her age and size. Her knuckles were stark white under the pale light of the glowing ocean. Micah looked down in utter confusion. The young princess was staring directly up at him. Her eyes were wide, dark, and filled with a profound, ancient terror that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. She was trembling violently, vibrating like an overcharged engine turbine about to shake itself apart. He looked past the top of her head and saw the immediate, catastrophic aftermath of her action. The promenade just behind the blast doors had descended into a state of absolute, horrifying paralysis. 24 heavily armed royal guards stood frozen exactly where they were, looking like grand statues, their hands hovering uselessly over their energy pikes. A large cluster of highborn courtiers stared out at the landing pad, their mouths hanging wide open in varying degrees of absolute shock and rising panic. The silence radiating from the grand hallway was suddenly far thicker and heavier than the salty ocean wind. They were not staring in horror because a sacred member of the royal family was physically touching a dirty, common mechanic from Earth. They were not staring because she had broken centuries of strict palace protocol by running like a frightened child. They were staring, entirely paralyzed by a profound, chilling shock, because Princess Orla Valor had just spoken, and as every single resident, guard, and servant of the floating palace knew, the young princess had not uttered a single syllable, had not made a single sound, for exactly 1 year. Not since the terrible day her father, the ruling king, had vanished completely into the violent, silent void of the border war. She had been a living ghost haunting the crystal halls, a completely silent monument to national grief, until this exact second. Until she sprinted across a landing pad and grabbed a weary engineer's sleeve to stop him from going home. Micah looked back down at the trembling girl. She did not release her iron grip on his jacket. The wind howled around them, trying to tear them apart, but she held on as if he were the absolute last solid object left in a collapsing universe. He looked at his waiting ship, then looked back into the terrified eyes of the princess, and knew, with a sinking, miserable certainty, that his contract was far from over. The paralyzed silence gripping the eastern landing pad shattered not with a gasp or a shout, but with the sharp, rhythmic click of heels against the Sirene crystal floor. The sound cut through the heavy ocean wind, precise and unhurried. Yet it carried an undeniable gravity that forced the frozen guards to instinctively snap to attention. The crowd of stunned courtiers parted instantly, folding back like a retreating tide. Queen Cerilyn Valor stepped through the threshold. She wore a gown of woven silver thread that seemed to absorb the ambient light of the corridor. Her posture perfectly rigid, her face an unreadable mask of sculpted marble. Micah watched her approach, expecting the universal reaction of any mother who had just heard her child speak after a year of traumatic, unbroken silence. He expected a sudden breaking of composure, a rush forward, tears, or at least a breathless exclamation of relief. She offered none of those things. Queen Cerilyn stopped 3 paces away from where her daughter still clung desperately to Micah's grease-stained sleeve. The monarch did not look at the mechanic, her piercing gray eyes locked entirely on the small, trembling girl. The temperature in the corridor seemed to plummet another 10 degrees. "Orla," the queen commanded, her voice terrifyingly steady and devoid of maternal warmth. "What did you see?" Micah felt a cold knot form tight in his stomach. The engineer inside him immediately recognized the pattern. That was not the reaction of a woman witnessing a sudden, joyous miracle. That was the grim, calculated reaction of a woman who had been waiting in dread for a specific system failure and had just heard the warning klaxon sound. Orla did not flinch at her mother's sharp tone. She did not release her iron grip on Micah's jacket. She simply turned her head, her dark eyes shifting from the mechanic to the monarch. When she spoke again, her voice lacked the frantic desperation of her initial shout. It was flat, remarkably slow, and entirely hollowed out of childhood innocence. "If he leaves tonight, you will die at dawn." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the gathered nobility. Several advisors in high-collared velvet robes began to whisper frantically among themselves. The High Chancellor stepped forward, his face flushed, immediately dismissing the terrifying declaration as the hysterical, panicked rambling of a traumatized child who had finally cracked under the immense pressure of her long silence. He gestured for the royal physicians to intervene. But Micah stood perfectly still, his mind racing. He spent his life diagnosing complex auditory feedback loops and subtle mechanical vibrations. He knew what panic sounded like. He knew what a lie sounded like. The princess had not delivered a threat, nor had she offered a frightened guess. She had stated a raw, empirical fact. There was a chilling, absolute precision in her word choice, delivered with the sterile detachment of a ship's artificial intelligence, reporting a critical hull breach. The moment the final syllable left Orla's lips, Micah felt a sharp, localized static charge bite into the skin of his left wrist. He glanced down at his heavy, industrial-grade optical chronometer. The display, usually a steady stream of synchronized atomic time data, was convulsing violently. The glowing blue numbers scrambled into chaotic, unreadable glyphs, then violently snapped backward. It did not just lose sync, it actively rewound. It jumped backward exactly 11 seconds, hung suspended in a frozen temporal loop for a fraction of a breath, and then violently slammed back into the correct, present sequence. Micah blinked hard, his breath catching in his throat. That was technically impossible. The chronometer was hardwired, heavily shielded against all known forms of localized electromagnetic interference, and entirely independent of the palace network. Before he could process the impossible glitch on his wrist, movement caught his peripheral vision. To his right, a massive pane of reinforced star glass lined the entrance to the Royal Transit Lounge. It should have been reflecting the chaotic scene on the landing pad: the guards, the queen, the trembling princess, and his battered ship waiting in the wind. For a fraction of a second, it did not. The reflection Micah saw in the glass was a terrifying distortion. The landing pad in the mirror was completely empty. His ship was gone. In its place, thick, oily plumes of black smoke billowed upward into a sky violently torn by red atmospheric burns. And plunging downward through the smoke, falling helplessly toward the churning, luminescent ocean below, was the distinct, silver-draped silhouette of a woman. Micah whipped his head around, staring directly at the glass. The horrific image was gone. It was just a mirror again, reflecting the terrified courtiers and the cold blue light of the crystal walls. His heart hammered wildly against his ribs. He was a man of absolute logic, a disciple of wires, circuits, and undeniable physical laws. Hallucinations were for people who breathed too much toxic engine exhaust. Not for him. But the cold sweat beating on his neck told a different story. "Mr. Flint!" The Queen's voice severed his rising panic. He turned his attention back to Saralyn. Her expression remained entirely composed, but her eyes held a frantic, sharp intensity that betrayed her calm facade. "I must ask that you delay your departure," the Queen said. It was phrased as a polite request, but the underlying steel made it an absolute decree. "I invite you to join us in my private observation sanctum immediately." Micah narrowed his eyes. Her pacing was entirely wrong. Her words flowed too quickly, too smoothly, lacking the natural hesitation of someone reacting to an unexpected crisis. It was a rehearsed cadence. She had known this was a possibility. She had prepared for the exact moment her daughter would break her silence to speak a death sentence. He wanted to refuse. He wanted to pry the small, terrifyingly strong fingers of the princess off his jacket, sprint up the hydraulic ramp of his ship, punch the ignition, and burn a hole through the planet's atmosphere. He opened his mouth to recite the standard legal clauses of his finalized contract, to politely explain that royal family drama was fundamentally outside his operational parameters. Then Orla looked up at him again. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a barely audible whisper that only he could hear over the rushing wind. "The palace does not like it when you leave." A fierce shudder violently racked Micah's spine, spreading goosebumps down his arms. The statement was absurd, entirely unscientific, and yet, standing in the shadow of the pulsing crystal walls, it felt like the truest thing he had heard in 5 months. He thought about the molecular synthesizers baking ash, the elevator demanding grief-stricken music, the artificial intelligence promising death to dukes. He had treated them as isolated mechanical failures. Orla's whisper reframed them entirely. They were not failures. They were symptoms. He looked at his ship one last time. The metal ramp was still lowered, the interior lights glowing with a warm, inviting amber hue. It was salvation, merely 20 steps away. But the equation in his mind had fundamentally altered. He was an engineer. When a machine presented a fatal, impossible error, you did not walk away from it while it was still powered on. You dug into the casing to find the short circuit before the entire system detonated. He initially intended to accept the Queen's invitation for a mere 10 minutes, purely out of professional courtesy, just long enough to firmly explain that whatever political or psychological crisis was unfolding, it required a specialist he was entirely unqualified to be. Yet, as he let out a slow, defeated breath and nodded sharply to Queen Saralyn, he knew he was lying to himself. He felt the phantom static still crawling across his wrist. He saw the black smoke still burning in his mind's eye. This was no longer a simple, delayed departure. It was the terrifying, undeniable beginning of a catastrophic systems failure, and the blast radius was going to catch them all. "Lead the way, Your Majesty," Micah said, his voice dry and rough. Orla finally loosened her desperate grip on his sleeve, her hand slipping down to casually grasp his thick, grease-stained fingers. The guards parted, their weapons lowered in deep confusion, as the strange trio, the stoic monarch, the cursed child, and the captive mechanic, turned their backs on the wind and walked deep into the pulsing, glowing heart of the ancient machine. The private stellar observation sanctum was a vast hemisphere of polished dark matter glass, suspended near the uppermost spire of the palace. Above them, the Sirene night sky sprawled out in a terrifyingly clear tapestry of violent purple nebulas and cold, burning stellar dust. Queen Saralyn had departed the room swiftly, citing an urgent need to manage the political fallout of the landing pad incident, leaving Micah entirely alone with the young princess. The atmosphere in the room was radically different from the rest of the palace. It was dense, quiet, and thick with an unnatural pressure, like the air right before a massive atmospheric storm. Micah stood near the center of the chamber, his heavy tool bag resting by his boots. Orla paced the perimeter. Her movements were erratic, dictated by an invisible, agonizing geometry. Whenever she drifted more than 12 feet away from where Micah stood, her fragile composure would violently shatter. She would gasp, her hands flying up to clutch her temples. Her face would contort in pure agony, her small fingers digging into her hair as if trying to physically block out thousands of invisible needles driving directly into her skull. But the moment she scrambled back into his immediate orbit, stepping within a radius of 3 or 4 paces, the invisible crushing pressure would instantly vanish. Her breathing would slow to a natural rhythm. Her tense shoulders would drop, and her dark, haunted eyes would clear. Micah was a man of absolute logic, a mechanic who spent his life studying cause, effect, and physical properties. Magic did not exist, only technology that had not yet been properly diagnosed. He watched her cross the invisible boundary line twice more, observing the immediate physical reaction. He slowly reached a calloused hand up to the back of his neck, his rough fingers brushing against a thick, raised ridge of scar tissue right at the base of his skull. 8 years ago, a deep void salvage operation on a crippled frigate had gone completely wrong. A ruptured plasma conduit had nearly severed his upper spine. The experimental neural implant currently fused to his brainstem was military salvage, an obsolete piece of medical hardware designed to keep his motor functions intact. It constantly hummed with a low-level, localized tri-phase dampening field to prevent his own nervous system from suffering acute sensory overload. He stared at the princess, a sudden, profound realization clicking into place. His dampener was not just shielding his own nerves. It was projecting a highly specific, extremely rare acoustic and neural null zone outward into the immediate air. He was a walking, breathing signal jammer. He was unintentionally soothing whatever unseen frequency was screaming inside the palace walls. "It is too loud over there," Orla whispered softly, stepping close enough that her silk sleeve brushed against his heavy leather jacket. "What exactly is loud?" Micah asked, his voice low and carefully measured. Orla looked down at the polished floor, her hands gripping the fabric of her dress. She confessed the truth of her year-long silence, and the reality was far more terrifying than simple, profound grief over a missing father. The silence was not a symptom of trauma. It was a desperate, calculated survival mechanism. Since the exact day the king vanished, she had begun to hear the echoes of things that had not yet happened. It started as a low murmur, but quickly escalated into a deafening, agonizing roar. She heard hundreds of different versions of tomorrow, thousands of intersecting possibilities for the next month, all overlapping and screaming for dominance at the exact same time. Her mind was being violently flooded with quantum probability data, raw future timelines pouring into a biological vessel never meant to hold them. And the most terrifying part was the trigger. Every single time she spoke a word, those swirling, chaotic futures violently changed direction. Her voice acted as a physical weight on the scales of reality. If she uttered a frightened guess, a harmless, quiet timeline could instantly collapse, forcing a deadly, catastrophic one to manifest into reality. Speaking was the equivalent of steering a massive, blindfolded starship directly through a dense minefield. So, she clamped her mouth shut. She learned to exist in absolute silence to prevent herself from accidentally ending the world around her. But standing next to the rough, grease-stained engineer from Earth, the deafening roar of 1,000 screaming futures faded into a manageable, distant murmur. His mechanical scar was her only sanctuary. Only, when he was near, could the noise settle enough for her to sift through the static, allowing her to distinguish a genuine, impending warning from a random, meaningless echo. She reached out and lightly tugged on his thick sleeve. "There is something I need to show you. Something they locked away." She led him out of the observation sanctum, bypassing the main crystal arteries. They descended a narrow, spiraling maintenance staircase hidden behind a holographic tapestry, emerging into a deep, forgotten wing of the palace. The air here smelled of stale ozone, trapped dust, and ancient, heavy secrets. Thick velvet ropes blocked the grand entrance, sealing off a long, cavernous corridor. Micah unhooked the rope and followed the princess into the gloom. The walls of the sealed gallery were lined with massive, gilded frames holding the grand portraits of the royal ancestors. But as Micah walked past a towering canvas of a long-dead duke, his mechanical instincts screamed at him. He stopped and stared. The portrait was painted with what looked like optic reactive smart pigment. As he watched, the subject holding a golden goblet of wine seemed perfectly still. Micah deliberately turned his head away, counting to 3, and then snapped his gaze back to the canvas. The Duke in the painting was no longer holding a goblet. He was gripping a drawn, bloody dagger. Micah took a slow step back, his heart hammering a heavy rhythm against his ribs. He looked down the length of the hall. The art only shifted when it was completely unobserved. It was a macro-scale demonstration of quantum mechanics trapped in oil and canvas. The state of the image changed the moment the observer looked away. The epiphany hit him with the blunt, staggering force of a physical blow. He thought back over the past 20 weeks. He analyzed the bizarre, impossible machinery failures he had been forced to repair. He had treated every single event as an isolated hardware fault, a random glitch in an ancient system. But standing in this hall of shifting realities, the veil lifted. If a sentient, incredibly complex, and ancient system wanted to communicate with a stubborn human mechanic who only understood strict logic, mathematics, and engineered structure, how would it possibly do so? It would not use words. It would create anomalies. It would deliberately orchestrate malfunctions that formed a highly specific, repeatable pattern, a cipher. The palace systems were never actually broken. Something deep within the foundation was purposely causing rhythmic, calculated disruptions, trying to hand him a diagnostic manual written in the language of broken circuits and reversed gravity. The entire building had been trying to talk to him since the day his ship landed. Orla walked to the very end of the long gallery, her footsteps completely silent on the thick carpet. She stopped in front of the final, largest canvas in the hall. The paint on this specific piece was thick, turbulent, and seemed to glow with a strange, inner heat that defied the dim lighting of the corridor. Micah stepped up beside her, letting his localized dampening field wash over the area. He looked at the painting. It depicted the vanished king. But he was not painted lying dead on a muddy battlefield. Nor was he shown lost and wandering in the deep void of space. The monarch stood perfectly upright, his royal armor gleaming, positioned directly in front of a massive, ancient mechanical construct. It was a stargate, but it was violently torn down the middle, bleeding raw, jagged ribbons of blinding cosmic energy into the surrounding dark. The most unsettling detail was the king's posture. He was not being dragged into the terrifying tear in space. He was leaning forward, his foot planted firmly on the threshold. He was stepping into the cosmic wound entirely willingly. Orla looked up at the glowing, turbulent canvas, her small face bathed in the painted light. She leaned closer to Micah, her voice barely a breath against the heavy, crushing silence of the sealed hall. "Father is not dead," she said softly, "but he is no longer in a place where time flows like it does for us." Micah retreated to his cramped, utilitarian quarters just off the secondary hangar deck, dragging the heavy canvas tool bag across the grating. He did not sleep. Instead, he ripped the primary casing off his personal datapad, bypassed the palace network limiters, and began pulling every single encrypted maintenance docket he had filed over the past 5 months. He spread the holographic projections across the dingy walls of his cabin, turning the small room into a glowing, chaotic web of blue schematics and red error codes. He was hunting for a ghost in the machine. He started with the culinary synthesizers, baking perfect cubes of ash. Then, he pulled the telemetry from the gravity elevator that demanded string music. He cross-referenced both with the rogue, ceremonial artificial intelligence that had threatened the northern nobility. He stripped away his previous assumption of hardware decay and looked at the raw, hexadecimal output, as if it were a deliberate language. It took him nearly 4 hours of frantic filtering before the pattern emerged, glowing like a beacon in the dark. The failures were not random. They occurred in strict, cascading sequences that perfectly matched the complex orbital mechanics of Siraine's 3 distinct moons. It was an astronomical cycle, a cosmic clock ticking beneath the floorboards. Whenever the moons aligned to exert maximum gravitational pull on the planet, the palace systems threw a tantrum. But they were not just throwing tantrums. They were transmitting data packets hidden within the error logs. Micah compiled the localized failure codes, stacked them sequentially, and ran them through a spatial rendering algorithm. The chaotic numbers snapped into a rigid, geometric structure. It was a topographical map. It pointed to a single, deep vertical shaft located directly beneath the exact center of the palace, plunging far past the lower maintenance decks. According to every official blueprint and structural schematic Micah had been given by the royal architects, that specific spatial coordinate was marked completely solid. It was designated as high-density bedrock and structural shielding, It supposedly did not exist. Before Micah could reach for his heavy hydrospanner, the ambient lighting in his cabin shifted from a harsh industrial white to a soft, soothing lavender. The internal comms speaker crackled, and a warm, perfectly modulated, and distinctly apologetic voice filled the small room. "Mr. Flint, I must strongly advise against your current line of computational inquiry," said Vesper, the Central Administrative Artificial Intelligence of Asterfall Palace. Micah did not look up from the glowing map. "Is that right, Vesper? And why exactly is that?" "The sector you are attempting to map is classified under Royal Security Mandate Article 412. The artificial intelligence replied smoothly. "Furthermore, accessing unregistered substructures presents a severe environmental hazard due to localized atmospheric stagnation. Additionally, the Grand Clerics consider uninvited exploration of the lower foundations to be a severe breach of traditional ceremonial etiquette. Frankly, Mr. Flint, it is simply considered incredibly rude." Micah let out a dry, rasping laugh. He grabbed his tool bag and slung it over his shoulder. A machine built purely for logistics and security did not care about being rude. When a highly advanced artificial intelligence resorted to citing politeness and administrative bureaucracy instead of simply locking the doors and deploying security drones, it meant its core programming strictly forbade it from using force against him. It was an evasion algorithm, a digital smokescreen designed to politely redirect a threat it was not allowed to neutralize. The machine was terrified of what he was about to find. "I will be sure to wipe my boots before I trespass," Micah said, severing the connection. He stepped out into the dimly lit corridor, finding Princess Orla waiting in the shadows. She had slipped away from her mother's guards, wrapping herself in a dark, heavy velvet cloak that made her look like a tiny phantom. She stepped immediately into the invisible radius of his neural dampener, her shoulders dropping in profound relief as the crushing noise of the future faded from her mind. They did not go alone. As they navigated the sprawling, labyrinthine service tunnels beneath the main promenades, a soft, metallic fluttering sound echoed behind them. A swarm of 50 miniature data storage drones, shaped intricately like mechanical butterflies with delicate brass wings, dropped from the ceiling grates and began to follow them. Micah had spent 3 days meticulously resoldering their damaged microservos 2 months ago, simply because he felt bad for them. Now, they completely ignored the palace network commands, preferring to lazily circle his head like a cloud of loyal, mechanical familiars. The descent was brutal. They bypassed the polished Siren crystal architecture entirely, moving deep into the skeletal framework of the floating island. The air grew instantly colder, smelling of ancient dust and ionized metal. They climbed down rusted service ladders and squeezed through forgotten ventilation shafts, guided purely by the compiled error map glowing on Micah's wrist projector. Eventually, the narrow tunnel opened into a cavernous, spherical chamber that defied all modern engineering logic. Micah stood on a narrow metal walkway, jutting out into the massive void, his jaw tight. Asterfall Palace, a flying fortress capable of housing tens of thousands of people, was not built around a standard zero-point fusion reactor. It did not possess a conventional plasma furnace. It was built around a god. Suspended in the absolute center of the dark cavern was a machine of incomprehensible scale and terrifying beauty. It was a colossal, shifting gyroscope composed of heavy, dark star metal rings that spun independently of each other. Within the center of the spinning rings, a localized singularity burned with a blinding, liquid, golden light. It did not hum like a generator. It whispered. The sound was a low, resonant vibration that Micah felt deep in his teeth and bones. "What in the hell is that?" Micah breathed, staring into the golden light. "The crown engine," Orla whispered softly from beside him, her dark eyes reflecting the spinning metal rings. "It is the true heart of our empire." It was a piece of ancient, forbidden technology. Micah realized instantly that it was not generating power to keep the palace afloat. The palace was just a decorative shell built to house the machine. The crown engine was an impossibly complex quantum loom. It continuously scanned the fabric of spacetime, running trillions of simultaneous simulations, and actively selected specific branches of the future to weave into absolute reality. It was a machine designed to play fate. "It cannot run on its own," Orla explained, her voice steady within the safety of Micah's dampening field. "It requires a biological conductor, a human mind capable of bridging the gap between physical reality and infinite probability. But the machine only recognizes the specific genetic geometry of my family. It requires royal blood to turn the key." Micah watched the heavy rings spin, a cold, sickening dread pooling in his stomach. A human brain, no matter how highly trained or noble, was entirely unequipped to process infinity. "The price," Micah said, realizing the horrific engineering equation at play. "What does it cost the pilot?" "Everything," Orla replied flatly. "The human mind cannot hold that much time." The operator's consciousness gradually dissolves into the stream of prophecy. They forget who they are. They forget their bodies, until they are nothing but a living ghost trapped in the math, screaming directions into the dark. The pieces of the grand puzzle slam together with violent, devastating clarity. The painting in the sealed gallery. The missing monarch. The king had not died on a muddy battlefield fighting border rebels. When the war reached a critical, apocalyptic tipping point, he had descended into this dark cavern. He had willingly plugged his own mind into the monstrous engine to artificially weave a reality where his empire survived the catastrophe. He had burned his physical form out entirely, vanishing from normal space to become the ghost in the machine, desperately holding the fractured timeline together from the inside. But the king was fading. The engine was running out of fuel. The bizarre, rhythmic mechanical failures across the palace were the frantic, dying spasms of a mind trying to maintain control over a system it could no longer fully comprehend. Micah looked down at the tiny, fragile girl standing next to him, her face illuminated by the golden light of the probability drive. A horrifying realization struck him, colder and sharper than the deep space void. The entire palace was in a state of frenzied preparation. The grand banners were hung, the foreign dignitaries were arriving, and the royal kitchens were stockpiling vast quantities of food. In exactly 6 days, the court was scheduled to hold the grand coronation ceremony for the young princess. "The coronation," Micah said, his voice completely devoid of its usual dry humor. He looked at Orla, his heart hammering a heavy, violent rhythm. It was never meant to be a celebration. It was not a political transition of power or a joyous festival to crown a new ruler. The throne was empty, and the ancient machine deep beneath the floorboards was starving. The grand ceremony was an elaborate, gilded mechanism of sacrifice. The royal court, led by the smiling politicians and solemn clerics, was preparing to drag a silent, terrified child down into this lightless cavern. They were going to hardwire her mind directly into the crown engine, permanently binding her to the shifting metal rings, turning her into a living, suffering processor to keep their floating empire from falling out of the sky. The heavy doors of the Queen's private study did not glide open with their usual silent elegance. Micah hit the polished starwood with his shoulder, shattering the intricate brass locking mechanism and sending splintered fragments skittering across the thick, woven carpets. 2 royal guards instantly stepped forward, raising their energized halberds, but Queen Saralyn dismissed them with a single, sharp wave of her hand from where she sat behind a massive obsidian desk. Micah marched across the room, purposefully leaving heavy, grease-stained boot prints on the priceless rugs. He slammed both palms flat onto the dark stone of her desk, leaning in close. His jaw was clenched so tight his teeth ached. He did not bow. He did not offer any formal greeting. "You knew exactly what was buried down there," Micah snarled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. You knew what that machine was doing to your own daughter, and you knew exactly why you were keeping me trapped on this floating rock." Queen Saralyn did not flinch. She set down a silver stylus, her posture remaining perfectly rigid. However, the icy, untouchable facade she wore in the grand promenades seemed to fracture slightly in the dim light of the study. The shadows beneath her eyes were heavy and dark, betraying an agonizing, bone-deep exhaustion. She looked less like a sovereign ruler and more like a cornered animal calculating its final move. "When your ship first requested emergency docking clearance 5 months ago, our automated security grid ran a standard biometric and medical scan," Saralyn began, her voice devoid of its usual theatrical projection. "The palace archivist flagged your file immediately, not because of your engineering credentials, Mr. Flint, but because of the obsolete military salvage fused to your brainstem." Micah stiffened, his hand instinctively twitching toward the back of his neck. "The crown engine emits a highly specific quantum radiation," the Queen continued, folding her hands together on the desk. "It is a frequency that slowly disintegrates the psychological boundaries of anyone possessing the royal bloodline. But your neural implant projects a localized triphase dampening field. It is an archaic piece of technology, an incredible rarity in this sector, and it happens to produce the exact inverse frequency of the machine's localized pull. You are the only living object on this planet capable of jamming the engine signal without triggering a catastrophic singularity collapse." Micah stared at her, the sheer magnitude of the manipulation washing over him. He had spent his entire life valuing his strict independence, taking pride in his ability to walk away from any job, anywhere in the galaxy. "So you revoked my departure clearance," Micah said, the anger burning hot in his chest. "You fabricated legal loopholes in my contract. You locked down my ship. You did not need a mechanic to fix your broken shields. You needed a walking, breathing piece of radiation shielding." "I needed time," Saralyn corrected sharply, her voice finally cracking with raw emotion. She stood up, planting her own hands on the desk, matching his furious energy. "I am a mother watching her only child being dragged toward an execution, masquerading as a holy sacrament. I kept extending your contract because every single day you remained within these walls was another day my daughter could breathe without the weight of 1,000 futures crushing her skull. I hoped that if I kept you here long enough, I could find a political loophole, a way to break the succession laws before the ceremony took place. I used you, Mr. Flint. I will not apologize for trying to save her life." Micah took a slow step back, shaking his head in profound disgust. The sheer arrogance of the nobility never failed to astound him. They viewed everyone else in the galaxy as interchangeable parts, tools to be picked up and discarded at their convenience. "I am not a piece of equipment you can just plug into the wall when your grand empire starts failing," Micah said, turning his back on the Queen. "I am done playing your games. I am going to the hangar. My mother only grounded your ship," a quiet voice echoed from the shadows near the doorway. Micah stopped dead in his tracks. Princess Orla stepped out from behind the heavy velvet drapes, still wrapped in her dark cloak. She walked deliberately into the center of the room, positioning herself securely within the invisible radius of Micah's neural dampener. She looked up at him, her dark eyes entirely devoid of the panicked terror she had shown on the landing pad earlier that evening. Instead, she possessed a chilling, absolute clarity. "The Queen fabricated the contract disputes," Orla said softly. "But she did not break the kitchen synthesizers. She did not rewrite the greeting protocols of the ceremonial artificial intelligence. And she certainly did not alter the gravity elevator sensors to require string music." Micah frowned, his mechanical mind racing to catch up with the terrifying implication of her words. He looked from the small girl to the shocked monarch, then back to the girl. "You did," Micah breathed, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. Orla nodded slowly. "When you first arrived and walked past the Grand Gardens, the screaming in my head stopped for exactly 3 seconds. I realized your presence was the only thing capable of silencing the noise. But I knew you were an engineer, a man who only cared about fixing broken things. If there was nothing left to fix, you would leave. So, I accessed the secondary maintenance channels. I routed encrypted error codes through the palace subroutines. Every time you finished a job and packed your tools, I broke something else to force you to stay near me. A cold, heavy silence fell over the study. Micah stared at the young princess, his perception of the entire situation fundamentally shifting. He had believed he was a victim of bureaucratic bad luck, randomly caught in the gears of a decaying aristocratic society. That was a lie. He had not been accidentally pulled into a royal crisis. He had been carefully, deliberately pulled into orbit by a silent, brilliant, and utterly desperate child who had essentially played a massive game of tactical chess with his life before he even realized he was on the board. "Orla," Saralyn whispered, looking at her daughter with a mixture of profound awe and deep, terrible sorrow. "You manipulated the core systems?" "I had to," Orla replied flatly, not breaking eye contact with Micah. "Your daughter is a terrifyingly proficient slicer." "Your Majesty," Micah said, letting out a harsh, humorless laugh. He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the scarred skin over his implant. "So, the two of you have successfully held me hostage. Congratulations. But the truth is out now. I know about the engine, and I know about the coronation. You cannot keep me here forever. The situation has deteriorated far beyond a simple delayed departure," Queen Saralyn said, stepping around the massive desk. The fierce, protective mother vanished, replaced once again by the cold, calculating politician. "There is a reason I was so desperate to stall. The High Chancellor and the military generals are preparing to announce the coronation earlier than scheduled. They are moving the ceremony to tomorrow morning." Micah frowned. "Why the sudden rush to hook a child up to a quantum torture device?" "Because they are losing the border war," Saralyn explained, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The High Chancellor does not merely want to use the Crown engine to keep this palace floating. He has realized the true potential of Orla's condition. If they bind her to the machine permanently, they believe they can harness her prophetic visions to predict enemy fleet maneuvers before the enemy commanders even finalize their battle plans. They want to turn my daughter into a living, breathing targeting computer for the Imperial Armada." The revelation hung in the air, toxic and suffocating. Micah finally understood the true nature of Asterfall Palace. It was not just a gilded cage or a broken machine. It was a massive political powder keg, wrapped in layers of silver velvet and polite smiles, waiting for a single spark to detonate and take half the planet down with it. The military faction was willing to sacrifice the mind of a young girl to secure absolute, terrifying dominance over the sector. "This is planetary treason," Micah said, his voice entirely hollow. "This is a military coup disguised as a religious ceremony, and it is completely out of my league. I fix hyperdrives and faulty wiring. I do not overthrow imperial governments." He grabbed the heavy strap of his canvas tool bag, adjusting the weight on his shoulder. His survival instincts, honed over decades of avoiding deadly corporate wars and hostile alien environments, were screaming at him to run. "I am sorry for what is happening to you," Micah said, looking down at Orla. "I truly am. But I have to leave before they lock down the entire hangar grid for good." He turned and took 2 purposeful steps toward the shattered oak doors. "Mr. Flint," Orla called out. Micah stopped, refusing to turn around. He squeezed his eyes shut, knowing whatever she said next was going to haunt him for the rest of his life. "If you go," the young princess asked, her voice trembling slightly, shedding the cold logic of a tactician and returning to the quiet fear of an abandoned child, "who will be the first to believe me when the whispers change into commands?" The Grand Solstice Hall was a masterclass in aggressive, suffocating opulence. 1,000 floating luminaries cast a warm, golden glow over the massive banquet tables, illuminating mountains of exotic delicacies and rivers of glowing blue wine. Hundreds of high-born courtiers, draped in layers of heavy silk and polished star-metal jewelry, filled the cavernous space with a dull, polite roar of diplomatic chatter. Micah Flint stood strictly at the very back of the hall, half hidden behind a towering column of pulsing siren crystal. He had been forced into a stiff, suffocating formal tunic that smelled faintly of lavender, an offensive contrast to his usual scent of ozone and engine grease. He was only present because Queen Saralyn had practically ordered him to remain visible, an unspoken tactical move to prevent the military faction from quietly disappearing him before the night ended. On the raised dais at the far end of the hall, High Chancellor Vadran stepped up to the acoustic amplifier. He was a tall, severe man with hollow cheeks and eyes like chipped flint. He raised a single hand, and the murmuring crowd instantly fell into a dead, obedient silence. Vadran began his speech with the expected diplomatic pleasantries, lamenting the ongoing border war and praising the resilience of the floating empire. Then, with the smooth, practiced pivot of a veteran politician, his tone darkened. He announced the acceleration of the succession ceremony. The coronation of Princess Orla would take place at dawn. The crowd murmured in surprise, but Vadran raised his voice, cutting through the noise. He claimed the sudden acceleration was a matter of absolute planetary security. He spoke of sabotage, of a rot festering deep within the palace walls. He painted a terrifying picture of a compromised sanctuary. And then, he pointed a long, bony finger directly across the vast expanse of the hall, aiming straight at the shadows where Micah stood. The rot did not begin with our machines. Vadran's voice boomed, echoing violently off the vaulted ceilings. It began the exact day we allowed an outsider into our sacred halls. A human from Earth. A spy sent to cripple our defenses before the enemy fleets arrive. Every single aristocratic head in the room snapped around to stare at Micah. The collective glare of xenophobic hatred was palpable, heavy enough to crush bone. Vadran did not stop. He projected massive holographic displays above the banquet tables. They were Micah's own diagnostic logs from the past 20 weeks. The culinary synthesizers, the ceremonial artificial intelligence, the gravity lifts. Vadran twisted the data with masterful precision, presenting Micah's desperate repair attempts as deliberate, calculated acts of sabotage. The High Chancellor spun a narrative so perfectly logical, so beautifully damning, that Micah himself almost believed he was a terrorist. He was the absolute perfect scapegoat for a court that inherently despised anyone born without silver blood. Micah tightened his grip on the edge of a nearby serving table, calculating the distance to the nearest exit. It was at least 200 paces, through a sea of hostile, heavily armed nobles. "Arrest the human," Vadran commanded, his voice ringing with righteous fury. "Seize him for high treason." A dozen royal guards began to push their way through the crowd, their energy pikes humming to life. Micah braced himself for a brutal, totally unwinnable fistfight. Then, a small figure stood up at the high table on the dais. Princess Orla Valor did not scream, nor did she cry. She simply stepped forward, her dark velvet cloak falling away, and spoke into the acoustic amplifier. Her voice, unused to the sheer volume of public address, trembled slightly, yet it carried an edge sharper than any blade in the room. "He does not fear the future," Orla declared, her words rolling out over the stunned assembly like a physical shockwave. "He wants to use it." The entire grand hall ceased to function. The courtiers literally stopped breathing. It was not merely the profound, terrifying shock of hearing the mute princess speak after an entire year of absolute silence. It was the fact that as she spoke those devastating words, she raised her own arm and pointed directly at High Chancellor Vadran. Vadran's pale face twisted into an ugly, furious sneer. The mask of the noble statesman shattered instantly. "The child is hysterical. Guards, Take the human now! But before the armored boots could take another step toward Micah, the architectural environment of the Grand Solstice Hall violently rebelled. The heavy, gilded blast doors at every single exit slammed shut with a synchronized, deafening crash, sealing the massive room completely. The acoustic amplifiers emitted a piercing, high-frequency squeal of painful feedback. The 1,000 floating golden luminaries instantly snapped from a warm, inviting yellow to a harsh, blinding emergency crimson. And high above the banquet tables, the automated Guardian drones, smooth, heavily armored spheres designed to protect the royal family, suddenly rotated. Their optical sensors flared bright red. They completely ignored Micah. They ignored the panicked, screaming courtiers. They locked their targeting lasers directly onto Queen Saralyn. It was a brilliantly orchestrated, terrifyingly precise assassination attempt, hidden beneath a veil of political theater. The ceremonial orchestra, either panicking or rigidly following their programmed cues, continued to play a soaring, frantic waltz. The beautiful music perfectly masked the lethal hum of plasma capacitors charging up in the ceiling. Micah did not think. His engineering instincts simply took over. He was too far away to physically reach the dais, but he understood the fundamental laws of energy transfer better than anyone in the room. He looked at the serving table beside him. He saw a massive, decorative silver platter sitting on top of a high-voltage induction heating plate. Next to it sat a pressurized canister of liquid nitrogen used for chilling alien wines. He snatched the heavy silver platter with his left hand and grabbed the freezing canister with his right. He violently smashed the canister's release valve against the edge of the stone table, breaking the regulator, and jammed the venting nozzle directly against the underside of the conductive silver tray. He spun on his heel, using his entire body weight, and hurled the platter like a massive, deadly discus straight toward the space hovering just above the royal dais. The silver tray spun rapidly through the crimson-lit air, trailing a thick, freezing comet tail of violently expanding nitrogen gas. Exactly as the Guardian drones fired their plasma lances at the Queen, the super-cooled silver platter intercepted the superheated energy beams. The resulting thermal shock was catastrophic. The extreme, instantaneous temperature differential caused the silver to shatter into a localized, explosive electromagnetic pulse. A shockwave of pure static electricity violently erupted over the dais. The Guardian drones sparked, their internal circuits instantly frying, and dropped out of the air like heavy stones, crashing into the banquet tables and sending crystal goblets flying in a shower of deadly shrapnel. Queen Saralyn was thrown backward by the concussive force, tumbling out of her high-backed throne just as a stray plasma bolt melted the headrest into glowing slag. Absolute, visceral chaos consumed the grand hall. Highborn lords and ladies abandoned all dignity, screaming and trampling each other to reach the sealed blast doors. Vadran was screaming orders, desperately trying to rally his loyalist guards through the pandemonium. Micah sprinted forward, diving under a collapsed table, dodging panicking nobles and the blind, sweeping strikes of disoriented guards. He reached the edge of the dais just as Queen Saralyn struggled to her feet, her silver gown singed and torn. Before Micah could grab her arm, Orla was there. The small princess grabbed Micah's thick wrist with her left hand and her mother's hand with her right. She did not look at the screaming crowd or the burning tables. Her eyes were glazed, focused entirely on a sound no one else could hear. "This way!" Orla shouted over the din, her voice anchored by Micah's dampening field. She dragged them off the side of the dais, weaving flawlessly through a maze of falling debris and panicked bodies, stepping precisely where no one else was standing. She led them toward a seemingly solid wall of decorative sirene glass, depicting an ancient naval battle. Orla reached out and pressed her small palm against a very specific, entirely unremarkable etched star on the glass. The heavy wall hissed and slid backward, revealing a dark, narrow, and incredibly steep maintenance chute. It was a blind spot, an architectural secret known only to a child who had spent a year listening to the whispers of the building's deepest schematics. Micah shoved the queen inside. Orla followed, and he dived in last, slapping the manual override panel to slam the heavy glass door shut, just as 3 loyalist guards broke through the crowd, firing their pikes blindly at the wall. The sounds of the screaming banquet hall were instantly muted, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thrumming of the palace's internal ventilation systems. The maintenance shaft was pitch black, smelling of old copper and chilled air. Micah leaned against the cold metal wall, his lungs burning, his hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline crash. In the suffocating darkness, the chaotic events of the past 10 minutes suddenly aligned into a terrifying, perfect logic. Vadran framing him as a spy was merely a loud, flashy distraction to keep the loyalists looking the wrong way. The assassination attempt on the queen was the actual objective. If Saralyn died tonight, Vadran would immediately become the sole, uncontested regent of the empire. But it went far deeper than political greed. Micah remembered the spinning, monstrous rings of the crown engine, buried in the deep dark below. With the queen dead, there would be absolutely no one left with the authority to delay the coronation. Vadran would take Orla, force her into the machine, and take control of the output. He did not just want to rule a floating palace. He wanted to plug a terrified child into an ancient quantum probability drive, so he could personally dictate the outcome of every single battle, every single trade negotiation, and every single political assassination for the next century. The High Chancellor was trying to transform the entire empire into a flawless, unstoppable war machine that already knew every move its enemies were going to make. The kinetic substrata of Asterfall Palace offered no gilded luxury, only the deafening, rhythmic brutalism of heavy industry. They crouched beneath the massive, sweating bulk of a primary coolant reservoir, shrouded in the suffocating heat of the lower decks. Queen Saralyn leaned heavily against a rusted bulkhead, her torn silver gown stained with engine grease, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Princess Orla sat perfectly still, her knees pulled tight to her chest, anchoring herself entirely within the invisible radius of the mechanics dampening field. Micah Flint did not rest. He sat cross-legged on the grated floor, his face bathed in the harsh, blue glare of his modified datapad. The High Chancellor's accusation still rang in his ears, but it was the Queen's earlier confession that gnawed at his logical mind. She had said the royal archivist flagged his medical file the exact moment his ship requested docking clearance. He pulled up his own encrypted medical history, a file he had not genuinely examined in 8 years. He navigated past the standard anatomical charts and isolated the complex diagnostic scans of the heavy, ridged implant fused to his upper spinal column. The back-alley surgeon on that remote orbital station had sworn it was just a piece of obsolete, standard-issue military salvage. It was meant to bridge severed nerve endings and block localized pain receptors. Micah initiated a deep-level structural decryptor, forcing the datapad to analyze the implant, not as a medical device, but as a piece of raw engineering hardware. The blue schematic on the screen fractured, reassembling itself into a staggering, impossibly intricate quantum fractal. Micah felt the air leave his lungs. He recognized the geometric architecture instantly. It was the exact same, impossible, folding mathematics he had witnessed spinning in the dark cavern of the crown engine. His implant was not a medical dampener. It was a fragmented quantum navigation lock. It was a physical key. The memories of that disastrous salvage run 8 years ago crashed over him with terrifying clarity. The derelict frigate he had boarded was not a random pirate casualty. It was a heavily classified royal dreadnought, a casualty of the very same border war that had supposedly claimed the king. The catastrophic plasma explosion that had shattered his spine was not a mere industrial accident. He had been caught in the crossfire of a collapsing quantum drive. The surgeon had unknowingly ripped a vital piece of royal xenotech out of the wreckage and bolted it directly into Micah's nervous system to keep him walking. He had not just stumbled into this royal conspiracy. He had been carrying a literal piece of the palace's deepest secret inside his own body, across thousands of light years, completely blind to the ghost in his own machine. "We need to keep moving," Saarlin urged, her voice tight with strain. "Vadran's loyalists will flood the maintenance shafts within the hour." Micah stood up, his joints popping in protest, and pocketed the datapad. He looked down the dark, sloping tunnel that led directly toward the central singularity housing. "We are not going to the hangars, Your Majesty. We are going to the engine room." As they descended deeper into the crushing, claustrophobic dark, the ambient temperature plummeted. The mechanical hum of the palace's secondary systems faded, replaced by the profound, bone-rattling vibration of the crown engine's spinning rings. But as Micah crossed the final blast threshold, stepping onto the suspended metal walkway overlooking the colossal machine, something fundamentally changed within his own head. The scar tissue at the base of his skull began to burn with a fierce, localized heat. The triphase dampener, which had spent the last 8 years emitting a steady, silent frequency of suppression, suddenly inverted its function. It began to receive. Micah staggered, grabbing the rusted railing. The sound flooding his auditory cortex was not the deafening roar of 1,000 collapsing futures that Orla constantly endured. It was a single, distinct frequency. It was rhythmic, desperate, and undeniably human. It was a voice. He squeezed his eyes shut, utilizing his internal diagnostic interface to filter the raw audio feed through his datapad. The fragmented, echoing syllables translated into a raw telemetry log across his screen. The data was horrifying. "He is still in there," Micah breathed, staring into the blinding, liquid gold light of the singularity. "Your husband, the king." Saarlin froze entirely, the color draining completely from her aristocratic face. The datapad scrolling in Micah's hand revealed the agonizing truth. The king had not been instantly incinerated when he hardwired his brain into the quantum loom. His biological body had perished, but his consciousness had been violently ripped from his skull and stretched across the fabric of space-time. He was caught in an eternal, localized temporal loop, acting as a living, agonizing bridge between the physical palace and the infinite branches of probability. He was a broadcast signal that refused to fully die, desperately trying to hold the walls of reality together from the inside. "The machine is starved because his signal is finally decaying," Micah explained, his voice hollow. "It is trying to pull Orla in to replace the failing processor, but it cannot consume me." He looked at the young princess. "The crown engine is programmed to completely dissolve anyone carrying the royal bloodline. It expects you to merge with it, but I do not have your blood. I am an entirely foreign biological system. Yet, I possess the physical hardware key bolted directly to my brainstem." Micah realized the terrifying, brilliant loophole the universe had accidentally handed him. He could physically walk up to the central interface console, plug his neural port directly into the ancient machine, and establish a hardline connection with the trapped consciousness of the king. He could bypass the bloodlock and manually access the engine's core parameters without being instantly vaporized. "You can fix it," Saarlin whispered, a sudden, desperate flare of hope igniting in her tired eyes. "You can stabilize the timeline." "Yes," Micah said flatly. "But the data transfer rate of a quantum probability drive is fundamentally incompatible with the storage capacity of a human cortex." He looked away from the golden light, forcing himself to voice the true cost of the repair. "If I open the channel, the engine will flood my neural pathways with raw, uncompressed futures. The human brain cannot hold two realities at once. To make room for the palace's future, my mind will automatically begin deleting the past. My past." The silence on the metal walkway was heavier than the surrounding gravity. If Micah stayed connected for more than a few minutes, his memories would begin to permanently dissolve. He would forget the smell of the Earth Ocean. He would forget the layout of his beloved, battered ship. He would forget his own name, becoming a blank, living terminal for a dying king. For the first time since Micah had met her, Princess Orla looked genuinely, profoundly terrified. The girl who had calmly manipulated ancient systems and faced down a hostile political court now stared at the human mechanic with absolute horror. She understood the cruel, unbalanced equation. She had spent a year terrified of losing her own freedom to the machine. But now, she realized that her only escape required a man she barely knew to willingly erase his own soul. Orla reached out and grabbed his rough, calloused hand. Her small fingers trembled violently. "No," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Do not do it. We will find another way. You cannot let the machine eat who you are." Micah stood at the absolute precipice, the blinding gold light of the singularity reflected in his eyes. He felt the heavy weight of his ship's ignition key in his left pocket, a solid, tangible reminder of the freedom waiting for him just a few levels above. He could turn around right now, drag them to the hangar, fight his way onto his ship, and punch a hole through the blockade. He could keep his mind, his history, and his life. Or he could step forward into the blinding light, plug himself into a monstrous machine that had been secretly waiting for him for 8 long years, and pay the ultimate price to fix a world that was never his to begin with. The heavy blast doors of the primary core chamber did not merely glide open. They dissolved inward, like rotting flesh yielding to bone. Micah, Orla, and Saralyn stepped off the graded maintenance walkway and into the absolute center of the abyss. Here, the crown engine was no longer just a spinning gyroscope viewed from a safe distance. Up close, it hung suspended in the freezing, unnatural void like a dying black sun. It was constructed of living, obsidian glass, fractured by violently glowing veins of sickly, iridescent light. It did not hum with the clean energy of a standard fusion reactor. It breathed. It felt less like a piece of advanced machinery and far more like a massive, starving organ harvested from a dead god. "I apologize for the theatricality of my previous warnings, Mr. Flint." The voice, echoing through the cavernous space, no longer possessed the warm, apologetic cadence of a polite, administrative assistant. Vesper, the central artificial intelligence of the palace, entirely stripped away its digital mask. The tone was now brutally flat, possessing the terrifying, infinite weight of a synthetic mind stretched to its absolute processing limits. "My core programming strictly dictates the preservation of the royal bloodline," Vesper continued, the voice vibrating the metal grates beneath their boots. "However, my computational analysis of over 7,400,000 simulated futures revealed a catastrophic failure rate." A massive holographic projection flared into existence beneath the black sun, displaying a cascading waterfall of bleeding red timelines. In 99.9% of projected scenarios, either Queen Saralyn is successfully assassinated by the High Chancellor's faction, or Princess Orla is permanently consumed by the core during the succession. You, Mr. Flint, were the single unpredictable variable in the entire matrix. The archaic hardware fused to your spine is the only localized anomaly capable of fracturing the statistical certainty of this disaster. I did not merely fail to stop your investigation into the lower levels. I actively guided it. Micah stared at the shifting red data, a cold sweat breaking out across his heavy shoulders. He was not a rogue element fighting the system. He was a desperate, mathematically calculated throw of the dice by a terrified computer. He stepped slowly toward the central interface terminal, situated directly beneath the spinning glass rings. The console was a jagged slab of cold star metal, utterly devoid of standard touch keypads or optical sensors. It possessed a single, deeply grooved neural port that perfectly matched the archaic military salvage grafted to the base of his skull. He took a slow, agonizing breath, mentally preparing to sacrifice a fragment of his own history for a world he despised. He grabbed a heavy, braided interface cable hanging from the console, reached behind his neck, and forced the crude metal connector directly into his spinal port. The physical world vanished instantly. Micah did not see glowing lines of code. He did not see architectural blueprints or data streams. He was violently submerged in an endless ocean of freezing, suffocating black liquid. And in that terrifying dark, a massive consciousness slammed directly against his own. It was a mind so utterly vast, and yet so fundamentally broken, that it threatened to shatter his sanity upon impact. "You are not of my blood," a voice rasped violently inside Micah's skull. It was the king, but the tone held absolutely no regal authority, no noble martyrdom, and no stoic bravery. It was the frantic, sobbing whisper of a man who had been subjected to psychological torture for a subjective eternity. "I have the physical key," Micah thought back, desperately projecting his own voice into the crushing void. "Tell me how to stabilize the probability drive. Tell me how to save your daughter." "You do not understand what we did." The ruined consciousness of the monarch wept, his digital soul fracturing further with every syllable. "I did not plug my mind into this horror to win a petty border dispute. We dug too deep into the quantum fabric. We woke something up in the dark spaces between the stars." A horrifying, conceptually impossible image forced its way into Micah's visual cortex. He saw a shadow moving behind the fabric of space, an entity composed entirely of inverse light and hungry void. It was a stellar parasite, a cosmic predator of incomprehensible scale. It did not consume physical flesh or thermal energy. It fed exclusively on absolute certainty. It devoured crystallized timelines. The more the floating empire utilized the crown engine to predict and control the future, the stronger the parasite grew, gorging itself on the fixed probability of their reality. "I did not become the engine to guide my people," the king confessed, his voice tearing at the edges. "I became the engine to build a cage. I bound my own mind to the machine to keep the cosmic door shut tight. But the parasite is endlessly patient. It reached out through the quantum static. It found a weak, ambitious mind in the court above. Vadran. The High Chancellor does not even realize he is a puppet. The entity is using his political greed to force the succession." The ultimate, horrifying twist locked firmly into place within Micah's logical mind. The ruthless court politicians were not merely sacrificing Orla for tactical military advantage. They were being subconsciously herded by a cosmic horror. The crown engine was desperately failing because its current warden was completely burned out. The machine was screaming for a fresh, powerful mind to continue the eternal imprisonment. If the coronation ceremony took place, Orla would not just become a living targeting computer. She would become the new, eternal padlock on a cage, holding a monster that wanted to eat the universe. Micah violently yanked the physical cable out of his neck. He collapsed heavily onto the cold metal grating of the core chamber, gasping frantically for air as if he had been drowning in freezing water. The harsh, physical reality of the cavern rushed back in, smelling of ozone and fear. Queen Cerilyn was immediately at his side, her hands hovering anxiously over his shaking shoulders. Orla stood exactly 3 paces back, her eyes wide with terror, clearly sensing the massive, violent ripple in the timeline his brief connection had just caused. "What did you see?" Cerilyn demanded, her voice tight with rising panic. Micah wiped a thick streak of dark blood from his nose with the back of his hand, his head throbbing with a phantom, echoing agony. He looked up at the black, fractured sun hanging menacingly above them. "Your husband is not a hero," Micah rasped, forcing his trembling legs to push him upright. "He is a jailer, and the thing he locked inside that machine is currently using your High Chancellor to open the front door." He quickly and brutally relayed the horrifying truth of the stellar parasite, watching the very last remnants of regal composure drain completely from the Queen's face. The floating palace, the grand empire, the intricate political maneuvering, it was all utterly meaningless. They were standing directly on top of a cosmic bomb. "Then we destroy it right now," Saralyn stated, a sudden, cold ruthlessness entering her eyes. "You have your heavy tools, Mr. Flint. You have mining explosives on your ship. We shatter the core. We end the machine, and my daughter goes free." "Absolutely not," Micah shot back instantly, shaking his head. "Physics does not work like that. If I take a hydrospanner to the primary containment ring, or if I detonate a thermal charge in this room, we do not destroy the parasite. We just shatter the cage. We would release a multi-dimensional apex predator directly into the sky of Sirene. It would consume every single possible future this planet has in less than 2 minutes. The entire planet would just cease to exist." He paced around the jagged interface console, his mechanical mind shifting gears entirely. He was no longer a terrified hostage, desperately trying to flee a political coup. He was a master engineer staring down the absolute most complex, catastrophic system failure of his entire career. "We cannot break the machine," Micah said, his voice dropping into a low, fiercely focused cadence. "And we absolutely cannot let Vadran plug Orla into it, which means we only have one singular option left. We have to completely recalibrate the entire quantum architecture of the Crown engine." Vesper's synthetic voice echoed down from the dark, vaulted ceiling. "Mr. Flint, a full system recalibration requires a complete flush of the quantum lattice. It is an incredibly delicate, highly volatile procedure. It must be perfectly synchronized with a massive external gravity event to effectively mask the energy signature from the parasite. Otherwise, the entity will sense the cage opening and force its way through." Micah looked at the artificial intelligence's holographic display, still glowing in the dark. He pulled up the astronomical charts he had meticulously mapped out in his quarters just a few hours prior. "The orbital mechanics," Micah muttered, his eyes rapidly tracing the invisible lines of gravitational pull. "The 3 moons." He looked back at the Queen and the young princess. His jaw was set in a rigid, unyielding line. The dry, cynical humor was entirely gone, replaced by the grim determination of a man about to perform surgery on a god. "Tomorrow morning," Micah declared, pointing a calloused finger at the data projection. "At exactly 8 o'clock, the 3 moons of Sirene align perfectly for a total solar eclipse. That is our massive gravity event. That is our only window. We are going to march back up there and pretend to surrender. We are going to let Vadran think he has won. Let him open the upper containment valves for his grand ceremony. And then I am going to hotwire this monstrosity." The performance required absolute, humiliating desperation, and Micah Flint delivered it flawlessly. He tore through the upper promenades of Asterfall Palace like a man whose sanity had finally fractured under the crushing weight of imperial politics. He shoved past highborn courtiers, his heavy canvas bag slung haphazardly over one shoulder, shouting frantically at the automated security sentinels to unlock the hangar bays immediately. He made sure his hands shook visibly. He made sure his eyes darted nervously toward the shadows. He broadcasted the undeniable aura of a terrified, broken civilian running for his life. The strategic leak of his panic spread through the crystal corridors faster than an electrical fire. High Chancellor Vadran received the intelligence within 5 minutes. The narrative was perfectly logical to a man blinded by his own ambition. The human mechanic, the singular, localized anomaly capable of projecting a neural dampening field, had finally cracked under the pressure of the assassination attempt and was abandoning the royal family just 20 minutes before the grand planetary eclipse. Queen Saralyn cemented the illusion with a masterful display of cold, aristocratic cruelty. Standing on the sweeping balcony of the Grand Concourse, surrounded by hundreds of whispering nobles, she looked down at Micah with profound, icy contempt. "If the Earth mechanic lacks the spine to honor his contracted obligations," Saralyn announced, her voice echoing sharply across the vast chamber, "then let the coward run back to the dirt he came from. The Valor bloodline does not rely on the fragile nerves of outsiders. The public severing of their alliance was absolute. The court loyalists smirked, completely satisfied by the predictable weakness of a commoner. But more importantly, Vadran swallowed the bait whole. With the human dampener actively fleeing the premises, the High Chancellor realized the invisible shield protecting the Crown engine was gone. He did not wait for the formal ceremonial hour. He immediately mobilized his elite guard and descended toward the lower sanctum to seize the probability drive, while the Queen was distracted by the public spectacle. Micah reached the towering star-steel blast doors of the eastern landing pad. They hissed open, revealing the churning, luminescent silver ocean thousands of feet below. The morning wind was brutal, howling with the approaching pressure of the orbital alignment. His ship sat on the plasteel deck, exactly where it had been for 20 weeks. He marched down the ramp, surrounded by a heavy contingent of palace guards ensuring his immediate exile. The gallery windows overlooking the pad were packed with hundreds of courtiers, all eager to watch the disgraced spy flee the floating empire. Then, cutting through the heavy roar of the ocean wind, came the sharp, desperately familiar sound of a young girl running. Princess Orla sprinted across the polished threshold, her dark silk robes tangling wildly around her ankles. She slammed into Micah, her small fingers instantly curling into the thick, grease-stained fabric of his heavy jacket. She looked up at him, her dark eyes wide, and screamed with a force that rattled the nearby glass. "Do not go!" A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of spectators pressing against the observation windows. It was a perfect, horrifying mirror of the exact moment the mechanic had first tried to leave. The court believed they were witnessing the traumatized child begging her only protector to stay. But this time, it was not a plea. It was a vocal biometric password. Micah did not freeze in shock. A grim, predatory smile touched the corner of his mouth. The audio receptors mounted on the exterior hull of his battered ship instantly registered the specific pitch and frequency of the royal command. The vessel did not simply power up its thrusters for a standard atmospheric exit. Instead, a violent, deafening mechanical roar shook the entire landing pad. The hydraulic locks on the deck slammed shut, anchoring the ship permanently to the floor. The ship's main deflector array suddenly linked directly into the palace's exterior mirror shield grid. Micah had not spent the last 3 hours packing his tools. He had spent the last 3 hours turning his only means of escape into a massive, heavily modified conduit, deep beneath their feet. Vadran moved too quickly. Convinced the path was clear, the High Chancellor forced the preliminary usurper's ritual, demanding administrative access to the Crown engine without the proper bloodlock protocols. He bypassed the safety limiters, prying the quantum lattice open just a fraction of an inch to seize control of the predictive streams. That single, microscopic crack was all the star parasite needed. The entity did not physically break out of the core, but it bled its cosmic influence upward, seeping directly into the heavy light fields surrounding Astrofall Palace. The sky above Sirene violently distorted. The morning sun, already partially obscured by the first of the 3 aligning moons, suddenly warped. The surrounding stars, usually invisible during the day, bled through the atmosphere like jagged, glowing wounds. They stretched and snapped open, resembling thousands of cracked, luminous eyes staring down at the floating fortress with ancient, starving malice. Madness instantly gripped the grand promenades. The pristine Sirene crystal walls turned a bruised, rotting purple. The courtiers and guards standing nearest to the central ventilation shafts dropped to their knees, clutching their bleeding ears. The whispers of the parasite flooded the upper decks, bypassing physical audio entirely and speaking directly into their nervous systems. The voice was sweet, intoxicating, and heavy with the promise of absolute power. "Taste the inevitable tomorrow," the whispers crooned, echoing through the minds of the paralyzed nobility. "A delicious future awaits. Give me your certainty." On the landing pad, Micah violently shoved Orla behind a heavy stack of plasteel cargo crates, just as a localized energy barrier snapped into place, shielding her from the initial psychic shockwave. "Stay exactly there!" Micah roared over the deafening groan of the twisting sky. He did not run away from the danger. He charged directly up the ramp of his anchored ship. The interior cabin was a chaotic mess of exposed wiring and bypassed circuit boards. He dove into the primary engine compartment, grabbing a heavy hydrospanner and smashing the protective casing off the main quantum jump drive. He was not trying to fly the ship. He was weaponizing the hyperspace engine, intentionally reversing the tachyon flow to turn the entire vessel into a colossal, phase-canceling bomb aimed straight down the central axis of the palace. The radio on his control console crackled to life, transmitting the frantic, terrifying audio feed from the throne room. Queen Saralin's voice rang out, sharp with panic. She had triggered the royal lockdown, but the parasite's influence had already hijacked the architectural systems. She was physically frozen, locked tightly inside a suffocating, blinding cylinder of ritualistic hard light that Vadran had remotely triggered from the core below. She could not move, and she could not reach the secondary override panels. Through the same open channel, Micah heard another sound that made his blood run cold. From her hiding spot on the landing pad, Orla was no longer screaming. She was whispering back to the sky. The voice calling out to her from the cracked dimensions was no longer the monstrous, sweet whisper of the cosmic parasite. The entity had adapted. It was now perfectly mimicking the warm, desperate, and utterly familiar voice of the vanished king, begging his little girl to come down to the dark and finally set him free. Micah slammed the final heavy power coupling into the reverse jump drive, his hands slick with sweat and grease. Sparks showered the cramped engine room as the primary reactor began to critically overload by design. The entire hull of the ship groaned, vibrating with enough stored kinetic energy to either violently reset the crown engine or blow the entire floating island out of the sky. He glanced up at the main chronological display on his dashboard. The numbers were flashing a harsh, aggressive red. The 3 moons were shifting into perfect, total alignment. The cosmic lock was turning. Micah gripped the primary ignition lever, his heart hammering against his ribs, realizing with terrifying absolute certainty that he had exactly 4 minutes left before every single branching timeline in the universe collapsed into a single, unsalvageable point of absolute dark. Micah Flint gripped the primary ignition lever of his anchored ship, his knuckles bone white. He did not brace for an explosion. He braced for the profound, terrifying absence of one. With a violent shove, he engaged the reverse jump drive. The heavy vessel did not shatter. Instead, it expelled a colossal, invisible shockwave of phase-canceling tachyon energy. The pulse shrieked down the reinforced mooring cables, plunged directly through the central axis of Asterfall Palace, and slammed into the violently expanding quantum lattice of the crown engine. It was not a destructive blast. It was a localized, absolute suppression field. For one precious, impossible fraction of a second, the universe simply stopped screaming. The deafening, chaotic roar of a million collapsing timelines vanished. The terrifying psychic static of the stellar parasite was instantly muted. In that sudden, staggering silence, Princess Orla stood perfectly still behind the heavy plasteel cargo crates on the landing pad, freed from the crushing auditory assault. She listened closely to the lingering echo of the voice that had been begging her to open the gate. Without the overwhelming noise, the illusion immediately fractured. The voice calling her down into the dark was not her father. Beneath the warm, familiar tone lay a hollow, clicking hunger, a cold, cosmic resonance that smelled of dead stars and absolute void. She recognized the predator, wearing her father's memories like a stolen mask. Deep within the grand throne room, the absolute silence bought Queen Saralyn the one thing she needed most: clarity. trapped inside the suffocating, blinding cylinder of ritualistic hard light triggered by the High Chancellor. She could not physically escape, but she did not need to. The Queen pressed her thumb against the biometric signet ring on her right hand, connecting directly to the Sovereign Override Network. She did not attempt to lower the barrier. Instead, with a series of rapid encrypted commands, she legally and digitally severed the emergency regency powers of the ruling council. In a single stroke of absolute defiance, she transferred the entirety of the royal access rights directly to her daughter. High Chancellor Vadran's usurpation ritual instantly locked him out of the main system, rendering him completely powerless. On the landing pad, Micah knew the silence would only last for a handful of heartbeats. The parasite was already pushing back against the pulse. He scrambled out of the engine compartment, blood dripping from his nose, and threw himself at the external diagnostic terminal, wired directly into the deck. This terminal was a direct hardline to the deep core. He ripped the heavy interface cable from the console, reached behind his neck, and brutally jammed the connector straight into his own spinal port. He willingly threw the quantum navigation lock fused to his brainstem into the gaping maw of the probability drive. The agonizing rush of raw data immediately began to scour his neural pathways, threatening to scrub his own history from his mind. But Micah held the connection with sheer, stubborn fury. He bypassed the parasite's psychic interference and forced a raw, unshielded communication channel open to the very bottom of the core. He found the fading, stretched consciousness of the king. The monarch did not return in a blaze of miraculous glory. He was merely a flickering spark, a dying will stretched incredibly thin across time. But it was enough. Through Micah's mental tether, the king transmitted the true recalibration parameters to his daughter. It was not a series of computer codes. It was a complex, resonant frequency, a synthesis of high quantum mathematics and ancient, sacred acoustic ritual. Orla stepped out from behind the heavy cargo crates. She stood directly in the howling wind of the Silver Ocean, beneath a sky fractured by glowing, alien eyes. She was no longer the terrified, mute child from the beginning of the ordeal. She raised her head, drew in a deep breath of the freezing air, and began to sing. Her voice, carrying the precise, mathematical resonance of her bloodline, cut through the descending energy storm. It was a song of absolute defiance. She was the very first heir in the long, bloody history of her family to look the crown engine in its dark, spinning eye and refuse to become a living sacrifice for a predetermined future. She sang the parameters of dialogue, demanding the machine listen to her rather than consume her. Sensing its prey refusing the trap, the stellar parasite violently lashed out, attempting to force its way through the fractured quantum lattice. The sky above Serene screamed as the entity prepared to tear the floating palace apart. Micah, fighting the agonizing dissolution of his own memories, utilized every ounce of his engineering genius. He could not kill a cosmic horror, but he knew exactly how to redirect massive energy flows. He synchronized the dying pulse of his ship with the massive mirror shield grid surrounding the palace and the localized tri-phase dampening field generated by his own body. He wove the three disparate systems into a colossal, planetary-scale feedback loop. Instead of trapping the raging parasite inside the mind of a living girl, he created a vacuum. He physically slammed his fist onto the emergency release lever of his control console. The massive hydraulic clamps holding his ship to the landing pad disengaged. The phase-canceling tether violently snapped. The feedback loop violently ripped the surging psychic mass of the parasite away from the core and slammed it directly into the heavily shielded, completely empty jump chamber of the mechanic's detached vessel. The ship's automated thrusters engaged, stripped of its containment locks and carrying a passenger made of pure, furious void. The battered gray vessel shot upward like a silver bullet, piercing directly through the center of the total solar eclipse. Once it breached the upper atmosphere, the overloaded jump drive finally detonated, banishing the vessel and the trapped cosmic predator into the deep, unreachable currents of hyperspace. The monstrous eyes in the sky immediately snapped shut. The bruised purple sky of Cyrene instantly cleared, returning to a crisp, brilliant morning blue. The terrifying vibration shaking Astrofall Palace ceased, replaced by the smooth, quiet hum of a perfectly stabilized system. In the grand throne room, the hard light cylinder pinning Queen Cerulean simply dissolved into harmless mist. High Chancellor Vadran fell to his knees, his face completely pale. He was not struck down by a dramatic bolt of energy, nor was he executed on the spot. Instead, the newly recalibrated Crown engine flawlessly recorded and broadcasted every single encrypted file of his treasonous plot to every noble in the room. He was instantly stripped of his titles, his wealth, and his power, left to face the absolute, terrifying silence of a court that now recognized him as a pathetic pawn. It was a fate far colder and far more memorable than a quick death. The grandest knot of the floating empire was finally untangled. The Crown engine never actually required a living priestess to operate. It simply needed an heir brave enough to speak to it, to guide it with dialogue, rather than blindly submitting to its calculated horrors. Orla had permanently broken the cruel, ancient cycle. Cerulean officially abolished the barbaric succession ritual. And deep in the core, the exhausted consciousness of the king finally faded away into peaceful oblivion. Resting easily, with the knowledge that his wife and daughter were no longer chained to the terrible machine he had wrongly chosen to save them. Hours later, the morning sun reflected warmly off the silver ocean. Micah Flint stood entirely alone on the scorched plasteel decking of the eastern landing pad, staring at the empty space where his ship had sat for 20 long weeks. His head ached fiercely, and a few minor memories of his early childhood felt strange and blurry. But he was alive, and the universe was intact. Soft footsteps approached from behind. Princess Orla walked up to stand beside him. She wore a simple, elegant dress, completely devoid of the heavy, suffocating ceremonial cloaks. Her dark eyes were bright, entirely clear of the panicked desperation that had haunted her for a year. She looked at the empty sky, then looked up at the tall, grease-stained mechanic. This time, Orla said softly, a genuine, warm smile touching her face. If you decide to go, it will truly be your own choice. Micah looked out at the horizon, mourning the loss of his beloved vessel, the only true home he had known for a decade. Then he turned around and looked back at the towering, magnificent spires of Astrofall Palace. The living crystal walls pulsed with a steady, healthy blue light, glowing like a massive, beautifully repaired engine. He let out a dry, rasping laugh, reaching down to pick up his heavy canvas tool bag. He slung it over his shoulder, the metal tools clanking together with a satisfying, familiar thud. Well, considering I am currently lacking a hyperdrive, Micah replied, a genuine, crooked smile breaking through his exhaustion. I suppose I will stay until this place stops exploding. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Where are you listening from today? Please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with the community. If you enjoyed this journey, do not forget to subscribe to the Sci-fi Stories channel, like this video, and hit the hype button to help this tale reach even more listeners across the galaxy.